Now, the subject of today's debate is how the geopolitical crisis influenced the power of deterrence and prospects for a new global security order. But let us start in Europe, and then we will zoom out afterwards. And before we venture into this uncertainty of the future and even of the present, let us go to one issue where I know that your analysis and your statements, which you have repeated here, is seen as very provocative in Europe, namely the why of the Russian invasion and the Russian aggressive stance towards Ukraine. And I would invite Carl to have some initial reactions to what John has said.
And I can do that, but let me start by saying that at least there is one issue where we do agree. We live in a more dangerous time. Power relationships are shifting, different competing interests are there, it is less predictable, it is more dangerous. On that we do agree. And there was an element of agreement also on the China analysis, we could go into that further. But on, obviously, the Ukraine-Russia, we do disagree. Yeah. I mean, to me it's abundantly clear. If you read what Mr. Putin said, as I said, he was very explicit in his speeches that setting up Ukraine was not only a mistake, it was worse than a mistake, it was unacceptable. Its old Russian land should never have been allowed by Lenin to set up the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And then he said, didn't make much of a difference, he said, because I mean, Stalin ruled it with an iron hand anyhow, but Stalin did the mistake of not taking away the formal structures of Ukraine. And the second mistake was allowing it independence. This is, as he said repeatedly, ancient Russian land. There's no question he wants to get rid of Ukraine. I don't think he wants to create the Soviet Union. His ideal is sort of Ivan the Terrible, it is Peter the Great, it is Catherine II, that's his Russia. And he wants to recreate that. It's not only Ukraine, it is undoubtedly Belarus as well. So his intention is abundantly clear in the speeches that he gave immediately before and immediately after the invasion. Then John said that, well, he didn't have the resources to do it. That's fairly obvious by now, agree. But we should be aware of the fact that when he attacked on February 24th, he attacked with 90% of the combat potential of the Russian army, 90%. So we were clearly, and he attacked from the north in order to get Kiev, biggest city, from the west to get Kharkiv, second biggest city, from the south to get Odessa, the third biggest city. He attacked with missiles every single major center across the territory of Ukraine. It was not some sort of Sunday expedition by some Russian forces who had got lost in the woods. It was an all-out invasion. It failed due to the fact that the Russian army was less competent than he thought, and as a matter of fact, substantially less competent than most of us thought. Because even the Western intelligence agencies who said he's likely to invade thought that he was going to finish the job in a week. He believed that as well. We know a fair amount of his political preparations. He believed he could do it in 1 or 2 weeks. The Ukrainians proved otherwise. But then on the background, John, I can understand that. You're nothing wrong with Chicago, but that's where you're coming from. So your perspective tends to be the Americans are all over the place and Europeans and others not really to that extent. It wasn't really, and I've written a book about it, I was there. It wasn't really the Americans pushing. I mean, we Europeans went to Washington and say you have to care about Europe as well, not only be obsessed by China. If there were anyone's pushing, Poles pushed in order to become members of NATO. The Ukrainians were knocking on our door all the time. We want a closer relationship with the European Union. We want to be part of the West. It wasn't the West going east. It was the East wanted to go west in order to get more of the security, the prosperity that they rightly or wrongly associate with the European Union and indeed NATO. And Americans were fairly reluctant in the beginning. If you take the entire crisis that led up to the first invasions, First the Crimea one and then the Novorossiya ones in 2014, the Americans were fairly absent from the scene. They were fairly absent from the scene because they were engaged in other things. It was the Ukrainians pushing, and rightly so, in my opinion. Then finally, just the Russians consider it an existential threat with Ukraine. Why on earth would they consider it an existential threat? I mean, that's pure fantasy land. I wouldn't deny that there are Mr. Patrushev and others. But we should take them out of that. If they consider their neighbors to be existential threats, they're going to be the one invasion after the other. There's no way that Ukraine is going to invade Russia. No one has ever thought in those particular terms. You said that Americans live peacefully. Yeah, Canadians are not going to invade. The Mexicans are not going to invade. You live in peace. There's no reason whatsoever why Russia and Ukraine should not be able to live in peace if just Russia gives up its imperial ambition.
What is your answer to this, John? How would you respond? Well, where are the smaller European states that sought protection from NATO and the EU once they had the opportunity when Russia was weak in the early 2000s, late 1990s? Where are they in your analysis? Wasn't this also small?
I'll answer your question, but I also want to deal with some of the points that Carl made. There's no question that states in Eastern Europe that were outside NATO wanted in. I don't blame Ukraine for wanting in. My point is we don't have to accept them. There's no rule that says just because somebody wants to be in NATO that we have an open door policy and we take them in.
And you didn't with Ukraine.
I actually don't believe that at all. We have actually doubled down.
They are not members of Ukraine, and no one has...
You have to let me answer the questions.
Yes.
Because,
sorry.
You raised a lot of excellent points, and I want to deal with them. But I think that if it's clear that the Russians view Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you should not admit Ukraine to NATO or push to admit Ukraine to NATO, because the end result is what you have today. We, in effect, pursued a policy that is leading to the destruction of Ukraine. If we had not attempted to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border, with NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolution, but especially NATO expansion, there'd be, in all likelihood, no war in Ukraine today. Crimea would still be part of Ukraine, and certainly those 4 oblasts that the Russians annexed would be part of Ukraine. But I just want to go back to a couple points that Carl raised. First of all, I've gone over in great detail every one of Putin's speeches, press conferences, and his writings. And the argument that he was bent on incorporating Ukraine into Russia is usually said to be outlined in a famous article that he wrote on July 12th, 2021. You can easily find this article on the internet. And he did say many of the things that Carl said about how it was regrettable, how Lenin set up the Soviet Union, and so forth and so on. He does not say in that paper that he is interested in conquering Ukraine, that it's desirable to conquer Ukraine, or that's what he intends to do. In fact, if you go look at the article, and this is the article that almost everybody points to, you should go read it. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian independence, and he says that the future of Ukraine is up to the Ukrainian people. That's what he says in the article that everybody points to is the key piece of evidence that he was out to conquer Ukraine. As I said to you before, I can find no evidence that he thought he could conquer Ukraine. Just a word or two about capabilities. He had 190,000 troops. It was almost all of his army, as Carl pointed out. You're not going to conquer a piece of real estate as large as Ukraine with an army that small. And he might have dropped bombs on Western Ukraine, but you can't conquer and occupy a country with bombs. You need ground forces to do that. He didn't have the ground forces. He never even attempted to conquer 1/2 of the country. At most, he attempted to conquer 1/3 of the country. He just didn't have the capability. This was not the Wehrmacht. Even with regard to Kyiv, he could not have conquered Kyiv with the forces that he had. It was just too small an army. He wanted to threaten Kyiv, but he couldn't conquer it. Now, just one final point, and then I'll turn it back to you, Cecilie. Carl said that if you look at what happened over the past few decades, it's a case of the East moving West and not the West moving East. I don't know how you could make that argument with NATO expansion. Of course it's the West moving East. NATO expansion, EU expansion, the color revolutions, where were the Russians moving westward? The Russians weren't capable of launching a military offensive in the 1990s. They were so weak, and then Putin comes to power in 2000, and over time he resurrects the Russians. He brings them back from the dead, but they don't have the military capability to go on the offensive. As you know, in the August 2008 military campaign in Georgia, the Russian army performed terribly. Right? They just don't have the military capability. There's no evidence that the East is moving west. It's the West that's moving east. And this is what presents an existential threat to the Russians.
But what about if you go back to 2007? That is when Putin, in his speech in Munich, announced that in his view, the multipolar world was already arriving. Now, in your presentation, you said 2017. That is 10 years later. So isn't it a possibility that Putin, from that moment on, has that in mind as he goes forward from 2008 and then interprets things differently?
The famous Munich speech in 2007 that Cecilia is referencing is where Putin first makes it manifestly clear that he is angry at the West for their policies, which he thinks do not take into account Russian interests. But he does not indicate that he's going to rectify this problem by going on the offensive and attacking any country in the world. What sets off the real trouble is the April 2008 decision at Bucharest. This is the NATO summit at Bucharest, April 2008, where NATO says at the end of that summit that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August 2008, you had a war in Georgia, and then starting on February 22nd, 2014, conflict broke out in Ukraine, right? That's what was driving the train here. And by the way, just one final point before I turn it to Carl. Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy were adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO at the April 2008 Bucharest summit. And Angela Merkel has recently said that the reason she opposed bringing Ukraine into NATO is that she understood, listen to these words, she understood that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war against Russia. That's in April 2008. But what did the Americans do? The Americans steamrolled her, and they steamrolled Sarkozy. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it all blew up in their face on February 24th of this year.
Your reaction to this, Phil?
Pure fantasy. I can agree with you, John, that sort of the Bucharest meeting was fairly muddled. There were the then president of Ukraine, the then president of Georgia who wanted in, and most people said no. And then as a compromise they had that particular language. But they refused them even a membership action plan. And you need unanimity in NATO. And since then, There's not been a single NATO meeting where there's been a serious discussion about membership. And even, I would say, even a half-dead second secretary of a Russian embassy in any NATO country would be able to report back that that was off the table for the foreseeable future. Off the table for the foreseeable future. What caused the big problem in 2013 and 2014, and I was there, was the fact that Ukraine wanted to have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And it was the Ukrainians who wanted it. They were knocking on the EU door time after time after time. Not everyone in the EU was enthusiastic, but evidently that was given. And then Putin said, this is utterly unacceptable. Forced President Yanukovych with the most brutal means to go back on that. That caused the people of Ukraine to go to the square in Maidan waving, they didn't wave American flags, sorry to say. They waved the EU flags on the Maidan and say, we want to be part of this. And why? Not because they were anti-Russian. That was not an issue at the moment. They saw the success of Poland, for example. Having done the democratic reforms and having done the economic reforms and having a substantially better economic and social and political development than Ukraine had. No question, they wanted to go the same way. And Ukraine happens, and that's fairly important to understand, Ukraine is a democracy. They have elections. They express their will to go, in this particular case, west. On going west and east is not moving geography. I agree with that. Geography doesn't move. But in political terms, they wanted to go west. Poland wanted to go west into NATO. Ukraine wanted to go west into the EU, as the Baltic states did. They wanted to go away from the east, which they associated with authoritarian and failed and repressive regimes in Russia. And that, I think, and there I can agree with you, I think Putin does see that as an existential threat. I think he does see a successful, democratic, big Ukraine as an existential threat, not to Russia, but to the sort of Russian regime that he represents. And he's been abundantly clear in saying that what is called colored revolutions, people waving European flags, people waving flags of others, people who wanted democracy, people who wanted to be able to elect their governments. He's been abundantly clear that he sees that as an existential threat to his Russian regime. In that particular sense, he's right.
Let me make two sets of responses to what Carl said. He makes the argument, which many people make, that there was really no chance that Ukraine would become part of NATO. And that we have sort of given up on that. I believe that's simply not true. And in June of 2021, NATO's conference was held at Brussels. In an official statement released by NATO, they said that they were reinvigorating their commitment to bring Ukraine into NATO. On November 10th, 2021, the United States and Ukraine issued a white paper laying out the strategic relationship between the United States and Ukraine, where we made it unequivocally clear we were committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Furthermore, we were arming and training the Ukrainians so that they were effectively becoming a de facto member of NATO. Many people wonder why the Ukrainians have done so well against the Russians on the battlefield. And they say it's because the Russians are incompetent, period, end of story. That's half of the story. The other half is that the Ukrainians were a formidable fighting force. And they were a formidable fighting force because we were training 10,000 Ukrainian troops per year from 2014 to 2024. And we were arming the Ukrainians. President Zelensky and his defense minister today refer to Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, in fact, and then in principle, we remain committed to bringing it into the alliance. Now, okay, go ahead. No, let me make one quick point just on another issue that Carl raised. Carl raised the point that the Russians viewed Ukraine becoming a liberal democracy as a serious threat, and you said you agreed with me on that. The point I want to make is that NATO, mainly the United States, was pursuing a three-pronged strategy. I tried to make that clear in my formal presentation. NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a liberal democracy. So it's important to understand that that third strand that Carl was talking about, where he and I agree, that third strand is inextricably linked to the second strand and the first strand in the minds of the Russians. So when he...
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Now, in the minds of Putin, don't say that Putin and the Russians are necessarily the same things. I've been involved with Russia intensely since the early 90s. I made a lot of friends. I worked very closely together with two Russian foreign ministers I still consider my friends, and one of them I'm still in contact with. And in the Balkans, we work constructively with them. I have to say that all of my friends from those years are either dead, killed, murdered, in prison, or outside of Russia. But those were Russians that wanted the same thing as the Ukrainians. They wanted constitutional government in their country. They wanted sort of decent living standards. They wanted free speech. They wanted some sort of democracy, might not have been Swedish standards. But Putin has a security regime that is different. And he has faced demonstrations in Russia that he fights with violence after he returned to power, and he's seen colored revolutions as a threat against his regime. That's why I'm saying, in that particular respect, he's right. He considers the colored revolutions, democracy in other parts of the former Soviet Union, as a threat to his regime. But that, to be precise, is not something that invented by me or by American politicians. That is demands coming from the people in these countries themselves. Democracy, it's called.
Can I?
But Paul, can I just quick go back?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to. I hope you don't mind us going back and forth, but
okay.
I mean, this
Go
fits
ahead.
together neatly. I think that if you talk about Russian elites regarding the issue that we're talking about tonight, the question is, how do the Russian elites think about bringing Ukraine into NATO? And you might think from listening to Carl talk that there's disagreement among the Russian elites. I do not believe that's the case. And Bill Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, he's now the head of the CIA, and he was the US ambassador to Moscow at the time of the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008, wrote a famous memo to Condoleezza Rice, where he said, for the entire Russian elite, not just Putin, Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines. He said, I've talked to all of the knuckle draggers in the depths of the Kremlin. And he said, I've talked to Putin's most ardent liberal critics, and they all agree to a person that Ukraine in NATO is unacceptable. So on that particular issue, which is the issue on the table this evening, there is unanimity. This is why, Carl, I would say that, you know, if Putin is overthrown, you're not going to get somebody in there who is interested in cutting a deal and living with Ukraine and NATO. You'll get somebody who's probably more hawkish than Ukraine, or at least as hawkish.
But where is the Ukrainian people in your analysis? Because the Ukrainian population in 2014 was divided on the issue. But as a result of what has happened in Ukraine over the past 8 years, more and more Ukrainians, also Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are kind of rallying around Kiev. And from February of this year, when the invasion took place, a number of powerful Ukrainians who have been more likely to support Moscow rallied around the flag. How do you explain that?
Well, anytime a foreign country invades your country, you're going to have a rally around the flag effect. Nationalism is going to kick in big time. I think there's no question that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has fueled Ukrainian nationalism, and it has brought the Ukrainian people together. I wouldn't deny that for 1 second.
But didn't Putin take that into account?
Yes, I'm sure he did.
How?
Look, Putin felt for certain that he was in a desperate situation. I mean, invading Ukraine is a matter of huge consequence. You just don't do that lightly. You have to feel that there is a serious security threat, because you might not know to what extent the United States and its European allies are going to come into the fight, but you know the United States is likely to come into the fight. You know how powerful the United States is. Putin was fully aware, you can document this, that the Ukrainians were being armed and trained by the West and were reasonably formidable. So for him to do that, he had to be desperate. This is my point about using nuclear weapons. You do not want to underestimate the risks that great powers are willing to take when they are desperate. And I believe that his attack against Ukraine on February 24th was an act of desperation. It was not an attempt to create a Russian empire.
Because in an interview in the New Yorker in February, you said that in your view, Putin was not going to try to build a greater Russia. He was not interested in conquering and integrating Ukraine into Russia. You suggested that we invented the story that Putin is aggressive and responsible for the situation. Now then, in November, you said, Putin's goals have escalated since the war started on February 24th, and he is now interested in conquering territory by annexing 4 oblasts in the east. Now, most analysts believe the opposite is the case, that Putin's goals were much more ambitious at the outset of the war, but he failed time and time again. The Ukrainian pushback took the Russians by surprise. The closing of ranks in Europe and NATO has been unprecedented since 2001. And how do you explain that a war has gone so badly for Russia has led Putin to escalate his goals?
Look, there's no question that when a war breaks out, and I could walk you through some of the big wars of history, that you get escalation in terms of goals, and you get escalation in terms of the means or the strategies or the weaponry that's used. I mean, you could get nuclear escalation. You get an escalation now where the Russians are attacking the electrical grid in Ukraine. So there has been significant escalation in terms of means, and there has been significant escalation in terms of Russian goals. The question on the table that we've been debating up to now is, what were Russian goals before the war? And as I'm arguing throughout the evening, there is no evidence that the Russians were bent on conquering territory. The Russians went to great lengths to make the Minsk II framework work, because the Russians did not want the Donbass. They wanted a Minsk II solution. It's when the Minsk II solution clearly had failed by February of this year that he invaded.
Do you have any comments to that? Or
No, go back slightly in history, because it's not entirely uninteresting, the history. We do agree with that. When the entire crisis started in the most acute phase, 2013, 2014, Ukraine had neutrality in its constitution, because they recognized in 2008 that NATO was not going to happen. Neutrality was part of their constitution. When Putin invaded and took first Crimea, and then to take all of the southeast, Novorossiya as he called it, and eventually was forced to send in the Russian regular army in order to secure parts of Donbass, neutrality was in the constitution of Ukraine.
We should have recognized it.
Yeah, but why should we recognize it? It was in their constitution. And I remember I saw Zelensky for the first time before he was elected president, in the beginning of his presidential campaign. I asked him about NATO. And he said, it's not an issue. I'm not going to mention it. It's not an issue. It wasn't part of his platform even. And immediately after becoming a president, he reached out to Russia. I mean, he's a Russian speaker. He's a Jew who Putin has now described as a neo-Nazi and drug addict. So the history is sort of, and you said we armed them. We didn't arm them. We didn't provide them, we did training, correct, we did. Even Sweden did training. We trained we trained the army in medical things, primarily for different peacekeeping operations. They were part of UN peacekeeping operations. And we helped them for training with that. We did not provide them with any arms. Obama refused that consistently. Merkel refused it consistently. Trump eventually did give them some anti-tank Javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles. And to be precise, he stored them in the west of the country. They were not even allowed to give them to the soldiers. They were stored in the west of the country, not even given to the soldiers, anti-tank missiles. How on earth could it be an existential threat to the second biggest army in the world that the Russians had? So if you go to this, there's nothing in this particular story. And the entire NATO expansion, just to go into the military aspect of it, if we sort of deal with the NATO thing, up to 2004 was the expansion, Poland and those countries, long time ago by now. But there was no NATO infrastructure, there was no troops whatsoever moving east. Nothing, nothing, nothing. With the exception of 2 fighter aircraft in the Baltic states doing air policing as a reaction to 9/11. It was only, and as a matter of fact, 2000, and all of the countries were taking down their defense expenditure in the West. 2013, the Americans took away their very last battle tank from Europe. We were all going down. We were doing nothing whatsoever. Then came Crimea. Then came his pressure on Ukraine. Then came Novorossiya. Then came the invasions of 2014. Then NATO started to give forces to the countries in the east because they said, we are afraid. We don't know what the man is up to. But prior to that, neutrality was in the constitution of Ukraine, and there were no NATO forces whatsoever in the new member states since 2004. So where is the existential threat? There was no one there who was going to invade and take down the Kremlin.
Well, there doesn't have to be an existential threat today. This could be, bringing Ukraine into NATO could be a stepping stone to bringing NATO forces.
You said that Putin was desperate when he launched the invasion. Desperate about what? I mean, it was not, diplomatic reporting, newspapers, there was no one talking about anything whatsoever, except the fact that the Donbas issue was unresolved. 14,000 people died. We should not forget that in the fighting in Donbas. But it was no threat to Russia in February of this year, none whatsoever. There is no justification whatsoever for the invasion.
Look, you're talking about bringing a military alliance that was a military foe. Right? It was a foe of the Soviet Union. And you're taking that military alliance and bringing it up to Russia's doorstep.
I'm sorry, Jon, but I think you and Putin are the only ones in the world who believe that that NATO was going to allow Ukraine in February of this year. There's no one else.
That it was going to allow...
But how can you argue
allow Ukraine to be a member of NATO? It was not on the table.
It was on the table. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, and we had redoubled our commitment to bringing it into NATO.
We had no forces there. They were not.
You don't need forces there. We didn't have forces in Poland, and we brought Poland into NATO.
John.
And now Finland is going into NATO. Estonia has been a member. Norway is a member of NATO.
I don't dispute that, but what is that going to do to the Russians? That's just going to scare the Russians even more.
One final question, okay.
It is not a threat to
Carl
Russia.
And John.
Sorry, yeah.
Now I cut. Now one final question, because in 2008, when Putin went to the Bucharest meeting and said this is a red line, the situation was far away from the Cold War. At the time, Russian ships were participating in a NATO operation in the Mediterranean. There was no threat comparable to that during the Cold War. Now, I want to bring us up to now, because, and I want both of you to answer to this, but I want to start with you, Carl, because for Europe, February of this year was a watershed in terms of how we relate to Ukraine and to Russia. Up until that point, dialogue had kind of been the name of the game to bring the troubles in Ukraine to a halt. And even after 2014, Germany and France participated in the Minsk Agreement to bring the conflict to a halt through diplomatic negotiations. But now we are in a very different situation in Europe. Many European countries, including Norway and Sweden, are outright declining the prospects of negotiating with Russia, particularly after the annexation of the four oblasts. The new European mantra seems to be the battlefield must first exhaust its potential. Now, what does this say about the prospects for getting this war to some type of halt? And you said so in your intervention, that there are two principles for European security today. First, aggression will never be tolerated. Second, borders must be respected. They cannot be altered by force. Now you are saying that we will not negotiate, nobody will negotiate in Europe or allow negotiations before Ukrainian territory has been reconquered. Is this what you are saying, or what other type of precedent can Europe accept? Because this will set a precedent for security in Europe for decades to come.
It certainly will. And it's, of course, not for Norway or Sweden to negotiate with Russia. Any sort of peace, if that was to come, will have to be between Ukraine and Russia. So it's up to the Ukrainians to define. Borders can be changed. I said borders can't be changed by force. They can be changed with agreement. But Ukrainians are very determined to keep that territory. That's not entirely unique if we go in European history. I mean, there are very few nations that are prepared to give away that territory to someone else who is invading them. They fight for their freedom. And I think the Ukrainians will fight for their freedom. And we will support them. And why do we support them? Well, we support them because, first, Russia is an aggressor. And secondly, because of these principles are at stake. If we sort of allow Russia to change borders by force and by aggression against Ukraine, we don't know what's going to be the continuation. I don't think necessarily they're going to invade Sweden tomorrow, but the fact that the Finns, the day after, more or less, the day after, February 24th, every single Finn thought about one thing, 1939, when Stalin attacked. And they said, we can no longer be safe without going into NATO. So I agree with you, and I think we agree on that. Prospects for peace are at the moment fairly bleak. It will be decided on the battlefield at some point in time. Diplomacy will come. But I will certainly give my support to Ukraine, fighting for its freedom and independence.
Does this look different in the countries that are closer to the Russian border?
It does.
And for the countries that are further away from the Russian border?
It does, obviously. I mean, I go to Tallinn, go to Riga, go to Warsaw, go to Vilnius, rightly or wrongly. Go to Chisinau, which has now lost all of its electricity because of Russian bombing. Rightly or wrongly, they believe they are next. That might be wrong, but they believe they are next.
I think you have to be careful, though, because of the case of Hungary. If you were to look at Hungary and Poland, they have fundamentally different views of how to deal with Russia.
They do.
Hungary shares a border with Ukraine, as does Poland.
Yeah, but not with Russia.
And how do you explain that difference?
That's an historical.
Yeah, I think that the Poles have a hatred of the Russians that almost knows no bounds and sees the Russians, the Poles tend to see the Russians as the font of all evil. I think the Hungarians have a more circumspect view of the Russian threat.
So you look then at historical animosity as coming into the equation?
Yeah, I think I think we would agree that the Baltic states and Poland, given the history.
But isn't this the problem of Europe? Because what Putin did in February of this year was basically to say that the institutions that the Europeans have built since the Second World War, and particularly after 2000 or 1990, and that you have been contributing to vastly, was the objective of having institutions in Europe that would prevent war between nations in Europe from ever returning again, and at the same time have economic cooperation. For instance, buying every possible drop of gas from Russia that was possible so that Russia would not, even think about importing the use of military invasion as a way of pressuring the situation in Europe. Now, these means did not work to prevent Putin from invading Ukraine. What now for Europe?
True, we built the Helsinki Principles, the Paris Charter, to go back, Helsinki Principles, OSCE. We have ongoing, as we speak, in Lodz in Poland, a ministerial meeting of the OSCE. Lavrov Russians are no longer there because they have violated every single part of what was agreed in the OSCE. So they are no longer allowed into that. That's a massive failure. Highly regrettable. I mean, I spent a lot of my time as foreign minister and prior to that, even as prime minister, trying to engage Russia in cooperation. And we did fairly well for a while. But things went wrong at some point in time. And I date it from the return of, it was problematic before. I mean, there's always been problems. I mean, it happens. But I date it really from the return of Putin on his third term. We see a distinct shift of policy when he tried to build up something that was entirely new, and when he tried to squeeze Ukraine into something, and then he went from one disaster to the other. And I think quite certain that Putin will go down in Russian history as a disaster who has created immense damage to Russia itself by misreading, misunderstanding, and mishandling the most important neighbor that Russia could have had, that is Ukraine.
How do you react to this?
I want to pick up on the question that you asked, Carl, and your story of what NATO and the West was up to. My argument, which is consistent with what Cecilie said, is that up until the crisis in Ukraine broke out in 2014, okay, NATO expansion and EU expansion and the color revolution, this three-pronged strategy, was not designed to contain Russia. Russia was not seen as a threat. It was designed to turn Eastern Europe into a giant zone of peace. It was designed to take those institutions that had done so much to create peace in the west of Europe and move them eastward. The idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO in 2008 was not designed to poke the Russians in the eye or to contain the Russians. You might not believe this, but Vladimir Putin was invited to the April 2008 Bucharest conference. He was not seen as an imperialist up until February 22nd, 2014. And that's why I said, once the crisis broke out, we had to invent a story that he was an imperialist. He took power in 2000, Putin. From 2000 to 2014, according to my higher math, that's 14 years. Over those 14 years, nobody was arguing that he was an imperialist. He all of a sudden, overnight, became an imperialist after February 22nd, because we had to blame him for the crisis. We couldn't admit that we caused it. But you see, we caused it. It's the hell of good intentions. I believed that you and your friends had good intentions. You thought that by spreading these institutions eastward, you would create a giant zone of peace in Europe. But it backfired, and it backfired over Ukraine because, as Bill Burns said, Ukraine was the brightest of bright red lines.
We are not going to get into the bottom of the why. The question now is what will happen to Europe going forward, because the type of deterrent that we thought was going to prevent the return of war, institutional building and economic cooperation, did not prevent Russia from going to war. In fact, when we have constructed the institutions in Europe after the Second World War, we have constructed institutions precisely for the objective of preventing states from invading neighboring states with the argument that there is a minority across the border that we need to protect, which is exactly what Germany did in 1939, in which, by the way, is exactly the argument that Putin also used in February of this year. After that, Russia has withdrawn or been excluded from a number of the organizations that we have in Europe to prevent further conflict. We are looking for a decoupling, in part, economically speaking, between Russia and Belarus on the one side, and the EU and Western Europe on the other. What are going to be the deterrent mechanisms preventing further conflict going forward in Europe?
That we don't know. But you are correct, they are de facto no longer part of the OSCE, they have de facto left. They have left the Council of Europe, which of course has to do primarily with human rights and democracy, which they are not very much in favor of. They have left a lot of economic cooperation. They cut the gas supply. Mind you, it's not that the EU has any sanctions on gas from Russia as of yet. It is Russia that is cut in order to influence the politics of the European countries. Where do we go in the future? We don't know. But as I said, I don't know where Russia is going to be a couple of years from now. I don't think Mr. Putin is going to be there. I'm fairly certain he's not going to be there. It could be chaos and conflict in the country. You can see the so-called power vertical that he's been running the country on. I think that will disappear. I think you will have different interests in Russia fighting it out. I think it will be very quite chaotic. The time of troubles, to take a phrase out of Russian history, will come back. Will there be an even more militaristic regime for a while? Could be, but I don't think it's going to survive very long. Will there be more normal forces asserting themselves? As I said, even Alexei Navalny being able to stand in a free and fair elections. I don't think that's the most likely scenario, but I wouldn't exclude that either. Russia is going to face a very, very difficult future. Ukraine even more. But we will help Ukraine to rebuild, hopefully to stabilize its democracy, hopefully to secure Ukraine, because if we don't secure Ukraine, we won't get to secure Europe. And then we can't really influence what's going to happen in Russia very much.
How does the US scholar look at this?
Yeah, I would actually like to use my time to ask Carl a question. One thing that strikes me, just listening to you talk, and I think it's true of a lot of people who I interact with, is I place a great emphasis on the nuclear threat. I live in fear that this is going to turn into a nuclear war. And my argument is that, as I said in my formal presentation, that the more successful we are, we meaning the West and the Ukrainians, the more likely it is that the Russians will use nuclear weapons. I'm surprised that you don't see that threat, that you don't worry about that. I mean, you talk about supporting the Ukrainians and whipping the Russians, right? And in a conventional world, you can think in an all-conventional world, you can think in those terms. But why aren't you scared, like I am, that this could spin out of control and we could all get vaporized?
No, I would be scared of that. I belong to those that gives a somewhat higher percentage of possibility of him in a desperate situation actually using a nuclear device. I don't rule it out, because I think the man in a certain situation could be extremely desperate. I think that would be the end of the entire thing. I think it would collapse internally in Russia if he does that, but that's a separate issue. But I will not give in to nuclear blackmail. Because if we were to do that and said, well, he's threatening with nuclear weapons as he does, so we cave in, we give up, then be damn certain he will learn that particular lesson. And he will threaten the one or the others with nuclear weapons, and we will give in. So giving in to nuclear blackmail is highly dangerous, and we must not do that. We are now trying to, and American and European diplomacy is doing that, building as much as a firewall against them using nuclear weapons as we can. Engaging the Chinese has been doing in the last few weeks, and the Chinese have been fairly good at saying that we shouldn't threaten nuclear weapons in the way that Putin is doing. Engaging the Indians and others.
Yeah.
Will that help? I don't know. But giving in to nuclear blackmail, I wouldn't do that.
But the thing is, Carl, when you're dealing with a rival great power that has thousands of nuclear weapons, there are limits to how far you can push against that great power. You can't threaten its survival in any way. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I do agree with that.
But you're talking about...
No, but asking Putin to go back and respect the borders of Ukraine is hardly to threaten the survival. It's not that we are threatening to invade Moscow. That's not going to happen. But asking him to go back to February 24th is hardly to threaten the survival of Russia. And if he wants to threaten nuclear weapons by trying to use nuclear weapons to defend the parts of Ukraine that he has already tried to take over, I wouldn't give in to nuclear blackmail, because I think that would be extremely dangerous. He would then use nuclear blackmail on the one issue after the other.
Okay, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but basically what you're saying is that you understand that there's a serious risk of nuclear war if we succeed in Ukraine, but you're willing to live with that risk.
No, I wouldn't use the word nuclear war. But a nuclear war involves both using nuclear weapons. I think even if Washington hasn't been explicit, but Washington has been very clear that if he sets off a nuke, the Americans will not set off a nuke. So we will not get a nuclear war. The response will be there, but will not be nuclear. And there are other ways
what will the response be? Because many people believe that what will happen is if the Russians use nukes, nuclear weapons, in Ukraine, that, as Carl says, almost everybody agrees, we will not retaliate with nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
okay?
So it's not a nuclear war.
But many people believe that what we will do is retaliate with conventional weapons against Russian forces. Then you have a great power war, United States versus Russia. And Avril Haines, who is the director of national intelligence in the United States, she told the Senate Armed Services Committee in the spring of this year that that's the most likely scenario for Putin to use nuclear weapons. Because if the Russians can't beat the Ukrainians on the battlefield, you can imagine what will happen when they're up against Godzilla, also known as the United States and its allies, right? So she was hypothesizing, I think quite correctly, that that's the scenario where...
And that signaling is what's called deterrence. That the Americans are making clear, rightly so, that if he goes nuclear, things will happen. If the Americans were saying instead that if he uses nuclear weapons, we don't really care, and we've got to back off, then it would be the end of this particular conflict. Then Putin will win, and he will continue. So don't give in to nuclear blackmail. I think if he uses nuclear weapons, the world will turn against him even more decisively. I'm not quite certain that it would be very acceptable in Moscow either, I have to say. I think it might implode the political regime if it does.
Yeah, now, but that's after he's used them.
Now, if we in one moment, expand the perspective beyond Europe and NATO and Russia and China and look at the rest of the world, one of the ways of showing for Russia that Russia is a global power is permanent seat of the UN Security Council, which Russia is using in order to prove that Russia is a global power. Now, if Russia were to use nuclear weapons, what will happen to the legitimacy of the Russian seat if Russia were to do that? Because the UN Security Council has had one major task over the past 30 years, and it is to prevent nuclear proliferation. This is what gathers all the permanent members, the one issue where they can agree. Now, if Russia were to use it, it would itself exclude Russia from that club, wouldn't you say that that would be a major consequence for Russia?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Look, states use nuclear weapons, pursue extreme strategies that involve using nuclear weapons when they're desperate, when they think they face an existential threat and they're losing. This was my point to Carl, that Carl's advocating a policy that puts the Russians in a position where they're losing, and that's a situation where they're likely to use nuclear weapons. It's like the Japanese attacking at Pearl Harbor. If you've never studied this case, you should go read about it. The Japanese understood full well that attacking the United States of America in December 1949 was not a good idea, in the sense that the United States had 10 times the gross national product of Japan, and the United States was capable of building much more formidable military forces and ultimately crushing Japan. Nevertheless, the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor because we were strangling the Japanese. We had cut off scrap iron in 1940. We had cut off oil in 1941. They were highly dependent on imports of scrap iron and oil from the United States. Their economy was in desperate straits, and we just kept squeezing and squeezing. They thought their survival as a great power was at stake, and therefore they were willing to pursue a risky strategy, a highly risky strategy. And the kinds of considerations that you're talking about go out the window in situations like that. It's not that you're wrong that that would happen to the Russians, that they would suffer in terms of how other states perceive them. It would have negative consequences for proliferation. I don't dispute that. My point is that is of minor consideration in a world where you think you're going off the cliff.
What do you think? Carl?
No, just go back to sort of the beginning of the war, and you say Russia perceiving existential threat, and so I think you saw as well, probably several times, you've seen this sort of meeting of the National Security Council on February the 21st, when Putin calls in all of the sort of members of the National Security Council and asks them what to do. And it was obvious that it wasn't pre-planned that much. And he asked them one after the other. He wanted one particular answer. We should grab Donbass. That's the answer he wanted. Most of them tried to avoid giving that answer. He had to publicly humiliate his head of external intelligence. The man who was responsible for Donbass said explicitly at that particular meeting that he thought the policy was wrong. There was virtually, the prime minister looked like he had wanted to disappear from the meeting altogether. It was only a couple of them that demonstrated even the vaguest enthusiasm for what they suspected or suddenly saw that Putin was intending to do. This was a decision for war driven by President Putin himself. It wasn't really supported very much by the Russian security elite. I agree with you. There's certainly no enthusiasm in Moscow for NATO expansion into Ukraine. But there was hardly anyone in Moscow who saw that possibility either. But there was even less enthusiasm, even in the ruling circles in Moscow, I would argue, for going to war with Ukraine. They were forced into it by Putin, and you can see it so vividly clear in that particular meeting that we have the transcript of and that we can see on the video. It was a Putin decision driven by, I mean, if you read all of his speeches and his historical vision and how he says it was a mistake to set up Ukraine and it... Är det amerikansk propaganda? Okay. No, sorry, it was Norwegian.
Yeah.
No, it was evident that, so I got lost by particular intervention by this.
He's a planted agent by me.
No, he's a Norwegian agent.
But the question, we come back to the question of deterrence. What kind of deterrent can we rely on in the present situation and going forward?
What are we deterring in your question?
We are deterring an escalation to a nuclear war. We are also deterring future war in Europe, because that is not any longer a guarantee that we have, because this happened in February of 2022. Now, I think that from a European perspective, Putin, this was the sacrilege of Putin, because he broke our illusion. You might call it a delusion, but it was the illusion that war between nations would never return to Europe, to the European continent. This has been a part of the European exceptionalism, and it is now broken. Where does Europe go from here?
No, what we are doing in terms of the nuclear issue that we are discussing, I mean, the signaling from the Americans is very clear. The signaling from the Chinese and the Indians is equally clear now. Will that be enough? We don't know. On other issues, how do we seek to deter? Well, Sweden and Finland are joining NATO because we think that will give us more security. That's a conclusion that Norway and Denmark took in the late 1940s. I think Norway is highly likely to also increase defense spending. Norway is increasing its security cooperation with the US. Germany is substantially increasing defense spending. Poland is substantially increasing defense spending. Is this enough? I hope it will be enough, because sorry to say, I think what's going to happen is that we're going to be faced with a fairly weak Russia in the years ahead. Because I see Russia that will go into, when they don't win this war, and I don't see them winning this particular war, I will see them go into a prolonged period of deep trouble. But that is a danger in itself. An unstable Russia is not a stable neighbor. So we need to safeguard ourselves, not necessarily against the Russians invading Ireland or the UK or Belgium, but safeguard ourselves against an unpredictable and dangerous regime that has a lot of other evil instruments of power. I mean, we've seen them using poisonous gas in European countries to murder opponents. It's a nasty place.
I think that with regard to your question, which is obviously a truly important one, Carl and I think about this very differently. The question of how to create deterrence and prevent nuclear escalation. Let's just go back to 2014 when the crisis breaks out. Crisis breaks out in 2014.
But John, short question. How would you prevent nuclear escalation?
Well, I'm going to answer.
Good.
I'm trying to sort of separate myself from you, or differentiate between how we think about this, to sort of get my hands around this whole issue. Because it's a great question, and these are complicated issues that don't have simple answers. But so let's assume it's 2014. The crisis breaks out, as you described it before. The Russians take Crimea. The question is, what do you do then? Let's take Cecilia's questions that she just asked and apply them in 2014 after the crisis is broken out. John's view is you back off, right? It's clear that you're asking for trouble, that you're poking a stick in the bear's eye, and that the bear will eventually lash out and you may end up in a nuclear war. I believe, and Carl can correct me when I'm done, that he would say we should double down, which is what we did. We doubled down. Then in 2021, when Joe Biden came into the White House, we began to reinforce our commitment to Ukraine. It caused all sorts of trouble over the course of 2021. You all remember Russia mobilized its army, was threatening on the borders of Ukraine. And then in December 17th, 2021, the Russians sent a letter to Stoltenberg and to Biden demanding that Ukraine not become a member of NATO, that military forces be moved back to where they were in 1997, and so forth and so on. So the question is, what do you do then? If you could play this one all over again, it's December 17th, 2021. I said at the time, and I'd say now, that's where we should have backed off and worked out a deal, because otherwise you end up with February 24th, right? So I think I know what I would have done before February 24th. But backing off now, it's almost impossible for me to imagine us backing off now, because I'm a minority voice Carl is the majority voice. He's not interested in backing off. He's interested in doubling down. He's interested in winning in Ukraine, throttling the Russian economy with sanctions. Again, I'm a hardcore realist. I'm an offensive realist. I understand of being hard-nosed in international politics. But I'm more dovish, I think, than you when you're dealing with a state that has thousands of nuclear weapons.
But given the audience has several questions dealing with what kind of scenarios could be realistic for the war in Ukraine to end. Now, given your distinctive positions, how would you see that? What would be a realistic scenario going forward for the war in Ukraine?
Well, I agree with Carl there. When you asked Carl that question in a slightly different form, he basically said it's very hard to figure out where this train is headed. I don't know how this one is going to end. Right? I do want to go to great lengths to make sure we don't end up getting incinerated in a nuclear war, but I don't know where it's going to end.
Because what I hear you say, also from your intervention, is that there is no obvious end to this war because Russia is not going to back down, and the Ukrainians, with the support from Europeans and the US, is also not going to back down.
Right. I said that in my formal remarks.
Go back to this Russia-Putin. Putin is not going to back down. And there might be a difference. I think there are a fair number of people in Moscow, even in senior positions, who would be interested in closing down this war tomorrow, if they could.
Would that include Crimea, withdrawing from Crimea?
Probably not. Probably not. So then we will be back to where we were. But prior to sort of February the 24th, where we did not have an agreement on Crimea, and I think it's going to take quite some time to get some sort of solution to Crimea. But I think the other issues, I would not consider it entirely impossible, that at some point in time we get the change, that sort of, they understand in Moscow that what they're heading into something that's going to be dangerous for Russia, not because we are going to invade Moscow, that's not going to happen, but it's going to implode. And they will try to rescue what can be rescued and go for something that might be acceptable. But that will only be possible if we can give, and I think we're talking about the post-Putin, it's not going to happen with Putin, and it's also going to be dependent on us helping to secure and give a new future to Ukraine. Because as I said, if we don't get a stable Ukraine, we will not get a stable Europe.
Carl and I obviously have differences about what caused the Ukraine war. And I don't want to focus on that in my closing comments. I want to focus on moving forward and how to think about Russia in the years ahead. I think that he and I have a fundamentally different view on how to deal with Russia. And that is, Carl believes that being tough with the Russians, teaching them a lesson, and winning back Ukrainian territory is the way to go. Whereas I tend to think that being tough with the Russians is a mistake. And I think that you want to remember that if this turns out to be a disastrous policy for the Russians, as Carl said it will be, they're still going to be there. They're still going to be there. They're not going away. And they're still going to be quite powerful. This is a really big country with a lot of people, a lot of human capital, many nuclear weapons. And you want to ask yourself, what a humiliated and weakened Russia is going to do. And this is what the question you want to ask yourself. It's kind of the question that the Europeans and the Americans faced after World War I with Germany. What do you do with Germany? Do you humiliate Germany, right? Do you try to rehabilitate it? How do you think about dealing with Germany, right? And this is the question that you want to think about. My view is that backing off and trying to work out some sort of modus vivendi is not a really great solution, but it's better than Carl's solution, right? My view is that you want to do everything you can to remove those incentives the Russians will have to cause trouble in the rest of Europe. You want to understand that if you back the Russians into a corner and you humiliate them, they're not going to roll over and play dead. Let me just go to the Western Hemisphere. You know we have the Monroe Doctrine. I had meant to talk about that this evening, but I didn't. We have the Monroe Doctrine, and that says that no distant great power is allowed in the Western Hemisphere with military forces. You cannot bring military forces into the Western Hemisphere if you're China or the Soviet Union or Germany or Japan, and you cannot form a military alliance with anybody in the Western Hemisphere. If China were to form a military alliance with Canada and Mexico, we would go ballistic. Now, the case you want to remember that proves this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Soviets put missiles in Cuba, and we had this crisis, and Kennedy and Khrushchev cut a deal, and the missiles were removed. We still have sanctions on Cuba to this day. We still have our gun sights on Cuba. We have not forgotten, right? We remember, right? Great powers don't forget. So you want to understand that if you box Russia in and you treat it like a pariah and you weaken it, they're going to be looking for ways to cause you lots of trouble. These Finns and these Swedes who think that joining NATO is a really good thing, I don't know about that. I don't think the Russian threat is that great, the Russian conventional threat, right? And I think you're giving the Russians all sorts of incentives to cause you trouble. So my bottom line, moving forward, and this is hard for a realist to say, but I'll say it. If anything, what we ought to do moving forward is try to back off as much as possible with the Russians and work out some sort of modus vivendi. That's certainly in your interest. And then it's in your interest, but not in our interest, for you to trade with the Chinese and become richer and richer. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much to Carl and to John for fierce positions and provocative statements and the good manners of identifying where you actually agree. Thank you for a very thoughtful and somewhat somber debate. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.